Everyone, and welcome to the IMAG Multiscale Modeling Pre-Meeting Webinar Series for integrating machine learning with multiscale modeling. And we are about to begin part 2 of the digital twin webinar, and I will introduce Dr. Leonardo Angeloni to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Grace. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Horner, who is a principal engineer leading the technical initiative for healthcare industry at ANSYS. And Dr. Horner has a PhD in chemical engineering from Northwestern, and he holds a number of industry leadership positions with a focus on model credibility, frameworks, regulatory science, and clinical applications, including the ASME VMV40 subcommittee, as well as the process modeling simulation focus group. Dr. Horner is also in part of the executive committee member of the ML-MSM credible practice on modeling and simulation in healthcare. And it's our pleasure really to have him. Mark, please go ahead and look forward to your presentation.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Leonardo. Thanks everyone for attending today. So what I'd like to do now is build off of the wonderful overview of digital twin that Rusty provided, and provide an example that's specifically within the healthcare space. So just as a little bit of a motivation, talk a little bit about what we're encountering today in terms of the complexity that we're encountering in medical devices and how digital twins can help us to address that complexity. We'll also see a little bit about how system-level modeling and simulation can address it as well. So a big trend that we're seeing in the medical devices of today is, we're trying to address this issue of portability. Patients who have, a disease like diabetes, maybe they have a heart condition such as a defibrillation, they want to still maintain a certain quality of life. And the way we can enable that with a medical device is by making that medical device as small and portable as possible, and also allow for patient independence. How we're doing that is by shrinking the package of the device, also making that device smarter, and then we're also adding connectivity to those devices so that they can communicate the current state of the device itself as well as the state of the patient back to a clinician so that they can monitor that patient remotely. To do that, we're now incorporating things like wireless power transfer systems into medical devices. We're incorporating a lot of embedded software into these devices to help with decision making and operation. Then we're also incorporating antennas into those devices. All that in mind, we're also asking the device to do the same thing that it was accomplishing before we integrated all these new systems and capabilities into the device. And so the question becomes one of how do we ensure that the device will perform as expected, with all these new subsystems integrated with the existing systems that were already present. So the challenge that we're seeing is one of system complexity. And what we're trying to do through modeling and simulation now, as part of the medical device industry, is ensure that when devices reach the market, they do perform as expected. To do that, we need to understand and optimize performance, and we need to do that as early as possible in the design cycle so that we don't make decisions that are hardened into the design and make a design change more complex later on, as we start to go to manufacturing. We want to, and what that speaks to is eliminating late-stage integration failures. We also want to improve collaboration among design disciplines. So we're not operating in a bubble, and that we have the fluids engineer speaking and working with the mechanical engineer and speaking and working with the electrical engineer, and similarly for the embedded software engineer, et cetera. We want all these different disciplines that all speak different languages to be able to work together with each other. Also through modeling and simulation, we're obviously hoping to accomplish those goals that we've been used to for a very long time, which is enhancing or reducing physical testing and accelerating innovation. And one catchphrase that we talk about quite a bit within the industry is digital system prototyping. It might also be model-based systems engineering. Some folks talk about pervasive simulation. In any case, all of those are keywords or buzzwords that we hear trying to address this issue of how do we ensure that we're bringing reliable products to market. One of the challenges that faces industry today is that design still happens in silos. So we have fluids engineers, structural engineers, electrical engineers, embedded software engineers, and all other kinds of engineers, all doing great work individually, and using tools that, at this time still tend to have their own sets of interfaces, the way, a user interacts with that tool is very customized to the language and terminology and setup that they're going to use, for fluid simulation or mechanical or electronic simulation. These are all very different. So they're all speaking a very different language. So in the absence of being able to unify all that language together, there's been a big trend within the modeling and simulation industry to provide, if you will, an engineering workbench where folks can at least be able to share data back and forth between those different modeling disciplines, so that instead of seeing those red brick walls that you see on the previous slide that are separating out and putting barriers between those different tools, hopefully we wipe that. Knowing that we want the great chemical engineer or great mechanical engineer, EE, et cetera, to be able to speak and work with each other seamlessly to provide that system level understanding that we want for our products. So as an example of model-based system engineering, I'll talk about insulin pumps. And you'll see why in just a second. There's a need from a population perspective, in that diabetes is a chronic disease that's becoming more and more prevalent. It's becoming a very high burden on our healthcare system. Another reason we're going to focus on that is there's a regulatory issue associated with these devices. We'll see that in just a minute as well. So the other thing that's good about these devices is that there's a natural connection between the system model that you'll see and then a digital twin for the patients themselves, and showing how we can have that digital twin model interact with a system model. So it's a really nice kind of overview that brings all these different kind of touch points together. I don't want to assume everybody's background in this call, so I'll just have one quickie slide background on what is diabetes. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, as we eat, sugars are absorbed from our stomach into the bloodstream. Those sugars aren't absorbed on their own into the cells, so that sugar can be used for energy. Instead, we need this hormone called insulin that's secreted by the pancreas to basically attach to those sugar molecules. And once the sugars are attached to an insulin molecule, then it basically acts as an escort and can escort those sugar molecules into cells. So essentially what you have when you, in the case of a diabetes, in the case, of an insulin pump, is an artificial organ. It's an artificial organ that's replacing the function of our pancreas. And they operate in two different modes. There's what's called a basal mode, where we're injecting just small amounts of insulin throughout the day to keep patients in homeostasis. So we're just kind of trying to regulate the sugar level within the patient throughout the day. And that's a pretty straightforward process. The real challenge with these devices is when you have a snack or a meal. For a mealtime, you have suddenly a large bolus of carbohydrates that you've injected into the system, and now the control system has to take over and keep you within that homeostasis so that you don't have too much sugar in your bloodstream, because that can lead to other side effects. Now that we understand the operation of the device itself, we have seen many regulatory issues with these products, and in fact, not just insulin pumps, but infusion pumps in general. So these are, when we talk about infusion pumps, we're talking about pumps that deliver drugs to the human body. There's been many issues with software defects, user interface issues, as well as mechanical or electrical failures, to the point where FDA even organized a group that was specifically focused on understanding and assisting industry with improving the performance of these devices, because there were so many adverse events and even deaths that were recorded due to these devices during this century. Now, one thing we could do is look at all the different individual elements of an insulin pump, ranging from the antenna design to the motors. We could do drop testing to ensure, they don't break when you drop them. We could, optimize the embedded software for the display as well as the controller. We can even go very deep into things like the drug delivery element of it. So looking at the infusion set itself, we can model catheter manufacturing. We can model the bend testing of that catheter. We can do pressure flow analysis virtually. We can even model drug delivery into skin. Lastly, we can incorporate human body models into our simulations and look at the interaction between the antenna inside this pump and the human body to ensure there's not too much energy being deposited into the human body, but also make sure that we have enough of a wireless signal strength that this can communicate, say, with our cell phone or our continuous glucose meter to maintain that connectivity and optimize the therapy. But these are all component level simulations, and while they're very nice and helpful, again, we want to get to that system level understanding of our insulin pump to ensure when all these different components come together, these things are going to function correctly as a system. So one project that I was lucky enough to work on over the past few years was to develop a system model of the drug delivery subsystem of an insulin pump. So those are all the different elements you see underlined in gray. We did some other work too, looking at durability of the pump, wireless communication, power management, embedded software, insulin PK. Something else we're working on right now is test strips. So it's been a really fun project for me, just being able to see how modeling and simulation can really help with our understanding understanding of this device and its different elements, and then bringing those together, as you'll see in just a second, to optimize performance. So in this case, what we're going to develop is a digital system prototype of the insulin pump, and specifically in this case, one of the drug delivery subsystem of the pump itself. Now, when we talk about model-based systems engineering, they typically talk about different domains of the model itself. In this case, for the drug delivery subsystem, for the model we developed, we have 3 different model domains. We have an embedded software domain that includes functional embedded software for the display and the controller. We have an electrical system domain that includes a controller as well as a battery and then a DC motor that's connected through a gearbox to a piston pump. And that piston pump is what's driving drug flow through a catheter and a cannula and ultimately into the patient. So here's our subsystem or our model-based system of the drug delivery system of an insulin pump. One thing that's nice to talk about here is how the information flows within this model. So in this case, I don't have the video. We just don't have the time to show it in the 15-minute amount of time that we have for this portion of the webinar. That said, at the very end, in my conclusion slide, I have a link to a video that you can find on YouTube that will show you this whole system model in operation. So I definitely suggest you go check that out to see how all this hangs together live. But just to give you an idea of how this system works, we have a display where we can enter inputs about the patient, such as how many carbohydrates did they take in, what's their desired blood glucose level, et cetera. Once that information is collected, we send a signal to the controller that says, here's how much insulin is required for this patient after having a meal or a snack. Once the controller has received that data, it then goes to the power electronics and sends a signal that says it's okay to turn on the motor, which then activates the hydraulic system, which delivers drug to the patient through a catheter and a cannula and eventually off to the patient here. So we're continually tracking as part of this simulation the volume of drug that's delivered. And once we hit the final units of insulin that the patient requires, there's a signal that's sent back to the display that says, okay, we can, the required amount of insulin has been delivered to the patient. Let's now shut down the motor, and the patient will know why. Another thing as part of our system model is a potential failure mode of the system. So one of the failures that can occur in these is that you can get an occlusion of that catheter line. And so the patient thinks they're getting the drug delivered, but they're not. And it's very dangerous for the patient because in that case they think they're being treated, but they in fact aren't receiving their therapy. So the direction the device industry has gone is to include a pressure sensor within the hydraulic system up here that's measuring the total pressure over time, and through the software detecting whether or not that pressure hits a certain threshold, and if it does, then we send a signal from the controller to the display that warns the patient that they're having a potential issue and need to examine their catheter line. So how we're accomplishing that in this case is to sum up the pressures that we are encountering throughout the system. Those are coming from the catheter, the cannula, as well as potential kinking that occurs in the catheter itself. I'm going to go through this very quickly, just being mindful of time. But in this case, we have kind of reduced order models that solve the simple laminar flow equation to give us the pressure losses in the catheter and cannula. And then what we did was to develop a ROM where we virtually bent the catheter at different bend angles. And then at each of those different bend angles of the catheter, we varied the flow rate through that catheter and came up with pressure loss for every potential bend angle and flow rate that a patient might encounter using this system. And through that then, we come up with a reduced order model representation of the pressure losses in there. And what we did was add that pressure loss in as an overpressure through the system. And what was really fun in this system model is we have a little bend angle knob. So it's a little piece of software in there where we can virtually bend the catheter. And at varying bend angles, it'll put in higher and higher overpressures. And you can imagine if that bend angle goes too high, you encounter this peak in the pressure in the system, and then we see how the system responds. So it's a way to not only see how does the controller respond, but also the display, et cetera. So it's a way to virtually test your system model to ensure that the embedded software, the controller, the display, et cetera, is all responding appropriately during a potential failure condition. The last thing we wanted to talk about here was to make a connection to the digital twin. So now we have this great system model of our drug delivery subsystem, but up to this point, the drug was just dumping off into free space. So the question now is, how do we make that connection to the digital twin? And how we did that in this case was using pharmacokinetics. So what pharmacokinetics does is uses a series of ordinary differential equations as compartmental models of the different compartments within the human body where that drug could reside. And then what we have are a series of patient parameters within these PK models that we can tune to then capture how that drug is distributing after it's been delivered to the patient. Just to give you a quick orientation on this set of equations, we have a subcutaneous concentration of insulin, we have the plasma concentration of insulin, we have an insulin effectiveness factor, and then we have the glucose concentration over time. So how this works is we solve for our, we inject drug into the patient, we solve for the subcutaneous insulin concentration, that moves to the plasma equation, we solve for IP. IP then goes in here and we solve for the effectiveness factor goes here, combined with our rate of glucose appearance, and we can get glucose concentration over time. Now there's a number of unknowns in this equation that are circled in red, as well as a couple knowns that we have from our patient intake of carbohydrates, as well as our insulin presentation by the pump. But we can use clinical data. So there's a really nice study back in the late 2000s by Kandarian et al., where they basically had patients in the hospital. They're able to control their carbohydrate intake over time. They tracked plasma insulin over time. They tracked the insulin delivery over time, and then their blood glucose concentration over time. And through this, they're able to basically solve an inverse problem and identify the patient-specific parameters on a patient-by-patient basis for this pharmacokinetic model. So then what we see is that, knowing the insulin delivery over time and our carbohydrate intake over time, we can now take data that we're getting from the patient and start to have a predictive model that tells us how can we best manage this patient's therapy. And coming back to what Rusty said, we could establish these parameters once, but then we're continually collecting this kind of data, so we can always continue to auto-tune this model as hours and days and weeks go on to make sure on a patient-by-patient basis we've developed essentially what's a digital physiological twin. So with this, I think I'm running up against my time, at the end of my time, so I'll let the viewers read these conclusions. Hopefully you got a really nice sense for how we can merge and bring together patient-specific data with system modeling to get a better understanding not only of how our proposed devices will perform, but also how they connect to the patient population and how we can use that to optimize therapy. Thank you for your attention.